I was going to ask you, is the notes that I'm giving you helping you any?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. They're very professional notes, by the way. They're all footnoted properly. So if I ever decide to actually do anything with these, I'm actually writing these in such a way that I can build onto them. Because like for this class, you notice, we're not doing a lot of commentary on the verses per se. Because if we were doing commentary on like 360 plus chapters, that comes out to like 3 or 4 minutes per chapter. You can't go really deep into a book with 3 or 4 minutes per chapter. So you all understand why a class like this, we're doing more historical background and giving you the big picture for all the prophets. And since I have my degree in history, just like Pastor Guzik, although I got my degree at Sonoma State University, he got his at UC Santa Barbara. However, my teachers were from UCSB, so if that means anything. The history part's important because if you really want to understand the context of the messages that the prophets are giving, if you don't know the historical context, you can learn a lot of things about what the prophets say and through the verses, but if you do not know the context in which they were written, you're missing out on so much of what the prophets actually have to say, because there will be too many nebulous statements and stuff where you think, what is he talking about? What earthquake? What, it's like you don't really know. So this way you're actually understanding what's going on in the lives of the prophets. And right now we're gonna talk about a prophet who was taken in the first Babylonian exile. Remember 605 BC, 606, 605 BC. His name was Daniel, okay? And remember, one of the things, and I might test you on this because I've been going out of my way, you notice in the handouts, to show you the actual way these names are pronounced. So that when you get up there and you're preaching or teaching someday, which I suspect that every one of you will at some point, you will not be able to say honestly, I don't really know how to pronounce those names. You will not be able to say that. If you do, you will be telling a fib, because I'm telling you how to pronounce the names right now. Okay, so first prophet, well, the only prophet we're going to talk about today is Daniel. Does anybody know anything about Daniel?
He was a prophet.
He was a prophet. That's very good. Anything else? 12 chapters in his book.
Yes.
Okay. Is he a major prophet?
Yes.
In reality, no. He's not really a major. We put him in the prophets, but in a Jewish Bible, he's not in the prophets. He was a statesman. He was like a prime minister. He was like Joseph. He was a prime minister of a large kingdom. Joseph was for Egypt. Nehemiah was a high official, a cupbearer in the Persian Empire. Daniel, of course, was in the Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. Probably the only person I know of in history that served at an extremely high officiating position in 2 successive world empires. Typically, when somebody else takes over a former empire, they kill the former leadership because they don't want those guys around to stir up trouble and stuff like that. Okay, so we are in the book of Daniel. All right, Daniel is pronounced Daniel. Daniel. Like Donnie L. Ale as, like a mug of beer or something like that. Okay. Ale, of course, is the name for God. I'm sorry, the pronunciation of God in Hebrew. Okay. So it's pronounced this way. Or if I do it this way, how would you pronounce that? Da. Da. By the way, when you're, say, looking at it from the German perspective, I mean, Can you like look at English and would you say da if you were seeing that? What would you say?
Da.
Da?
Da.
Really?
Yeah.
With a V?
The W is in German.
Is a W is a what in German? A V?
Yeah.
Just like Hebrew. Very good. Yeah. Like it is not Yahweh, it is Yahweh. This letter right here is not a Wa, it's a Vav. See, she's got a head start on every one of you for the Hebrew class that I've always wanted to teach her. Teach you guys the alphabet. Okay, so anyway, how about if you, Dalila, if you saw this, would you say da?
Da.
Okay. Okay, so da. How would you pronounce that? Ni. Da, ni. Da, ni, el. That's how you pronounce Daniel in Hebrew. Da, ni, el. We say, of course, in English, Daniel. But it's actually da, ni, el. Okay. It's no half vowels or anything. They're all full vowels. So it's da, ni, el. Everybody say it. Da, ni, el. Just like singing the song, right? Okay. That is a correct way to pronounce Daniel. If you want proof for that, if you look in Strong's Exhaustive Concordance of the Bible, the Hebrew Aramaic Dictionary, Strong's number 1840, you will notice that they'll give you a phonetic spelling of it. It'll be something like that. You all know what I mean when I say phonetic spelling. They spell out how it sounds. Keenan, you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And his name means judge of God, or my judge is God. Okay? The MacArthur Study Bible renders the meaning of Daniel as God is my judge. By the way, they're all saying the same thing. You'll see that. God is my judge. The judge is my God. I mean, they're all basically the same meaning. You can kind of move things around in the English. Okay, so Daniel, the prophet, is mentioned by name in the Bible 78 times. 76 times in the Old Testament, 3 times in Ezekiel, 73 times in the book of Daniel. So he refers to himself a lot, okay? And twice in the New Testament. Anybody care to venture where his name is mentioned in the New Testament? Yes.
Matthew.
Matthew and... on what occasion was he speaking?
Oh, Revelation.
The what?
I was going to say, is he also mentioned
In Matthew, in what discourse was he referred to? The what?
Was it Olivet?
The Olivet Discourse. Where else is the Olivet Discourse in the Bible besides Matthew? Good guess, but it's wrong. Okay. Mark, book of Mark, Mark 13. Okay, so twice in the New Testament, and of course it's Jesus himself who refers to Daniel. So let's take a look at some prophetic facts and the length of the book of Daniel. Okay, and you'll notice the style that I'm using. I'm doing this for every single prophetic book that we cover, which will be all 16 of them. Daniel is composed of 12 chapters, a total of 357 verses. There are 58 separate prophecies, and by the way, that's dependent upon how you break them down, because you could argue there's about 113 distinct prophecies just in Daniel chapter 11 alone, okay? Depending upon how you group the verses together. There are 162 prophetic verses out of 357, making Daniel 45% prophetic, okay? Now, when I say that, do you all understand what I mean when I say it's 45% prophetic? It means like the rest of the book is, it's historical narrative or something like that. It's kind of like letting you know what's going on with in the prophet's life and stuff. Okay. Oh, by the way, Daniel's one of the books that talks about the resurrection. He's one of the books that talks about the resurrection, And it's interesting that this is just a sidelight. You don't need to know this for the test, unless I have it like for an extra credit or something like that. But there's 357 verses, which divides into 3 times 119. 119 is the number for resurrection, okay? And how do I know that? 3 times 7 times 17. This number right here breaks down into 7 times 17. If you will remember, I'm sure you do from my Genesis class, Noah's Ark landed on the mountains of Ararat and was stationary in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, which happens to be the day of first fruits. First fruits, what day did Christ rise from the dead? First fruits. So Daniel, which interestingly is one of the few books in the Old Testament that talks about resurrection, it just so happens that in the structure of the book itself that it portrays resurrection. Okay. If you ever get interested in gematria in the Bible, the study of numbers, how numbers are used in the Bible, you'll find this very interesting. But you all don't look really excited about it right now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and erase it. See if I ever give you anything extra again. Okay. We all ready to go? Okay. So anyway, J. Dwight Pentecost. Anybody know J. Dwight Pentecost? Not personally, but have you heard of him? Not even you people from Texas? He was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary for many, many, many years. Okay. He was one of Hal Lindsey's professors. He was Chuck Swindoll, one of Chuck Swindoll's professors. Now, does it ring a bell? No? Okay, that's okay. Okay, J. Dwight Pentecost states, quote, "The man Daniel is not referred to in his book as a prophet. Yet, Jesus called Daniel a prophet in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. Okay. But Daniel, his office was actually literally that of a prime minister. Daniel is one of 2 prophetic books that predict the death of the future Messiah. Daniel 9:26, the first part of the verse predicts, was saying basically that the long-awaited Messiah that the Jewish people were waiting for, Daniel states that when in fact this Messiah shows up, the Jews were going to kill him. Okay. Does anybody know the other prophet who stated that? We covered him.
Isaiah?
Huh? Isaiah chapter 53. Yeah. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 8. So, the book of Daniel is also called the backbone of Bible prophecy. That's by J. Vernon McGee. Anybody know who J. Vernon McGee is? Mm-hmm. Does anybody know what state he is from? What? Texas. He's from Houston, Texas. Okay.
Oh, you just said him just right now earlier with the other professor guy, right?
Yeah, J. White. Yeah. Well, he taught at Dallas Theological Seminary, and of course he was mostly famous for the Living Insights Bible, and he was a pastor in Fullerton, California, near Cal State Fullerton, near Disneyland, sort of. Anybody know where he is now today? Preaching today as we speak at this, well, at least he's working at this place. Anybody know? Huh? Texas, Plano, Texas. Plain old Texas is where he is at. Okay, you all know where Plano is, right? Not Play-Doh, but Plano. Okay, okay. I did as a joke. Plain old Texas. Okay. Okay. Plano, Texas. Yeah.
It's flat over there.
Yeah. By the way, does anybody know where Hal Lindsey is from?
Texas.
Texas. You all know that? How'd you all know that?
Lucky guy.
Okay.
Oh, divine inspiration.
Okay, so where is J. Vernon McGee from?
Texas.
Texas, okay. What does this tell you about the state of Texas?
We are a godly country.
We are a godly state, right? A lot of famous theologians come from Texas.
We are.
Mhm.
He just
Let me know when you guys go on break.
You could address that to me if you want. I'll let you know when they go on break.
Okay.
It'll be really, it'll be really soon, Mike. Okay, really, really soon.
Cool.
Soon and very soon. Okay. We'll cover probably out maybe. Okay. So J. Vernon McGee boldly states, quote, Daniel gives us the skeleton of prophecy on which all prophecy is placed. The image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel chapter 2, and the beast, Daniel chapter 7, are the backbone of prophecy. The 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9 are the ribs which fit into their proper place. That's through the Bible radio, through the Bible, which is on the radio, volume 3, page 525. Okay. Tim LaHaye, y'all know Tim LaHaye. Where is Tim LaHaye from?
Oklahoma.
Okay. I honestly don't know where he is from, but I know he ministered in San Diego, California. He says, quote, a proper understanding of Daniel assists in a proper interpretation of the book of Revelation. Hence, if you have been through my Revelation class, you notice I always went back to the book of Daniel because it lays the groundwork for the book of Revelation. And if we actually had more time in the book of Revelation, we would have spent a lot of time in the book of Zechariah, because I maintain if you don't know the book of Zechariah, you have a hard time with the book of Revelation also, because Zechariah is an extremely apocalyptic prophetic book. Chuck Smith. Does anybody know where Chuck Smith is from?
California.
Where in California? Where was that guy born?
Costa Mesa.
No. What?
Okay.
That's where he grew up, but where was he born?
Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara, yes. You right here are in the very place where Chuck Smith was born, yeah?
Tim LaHaye's from Detroit, Michigan.
Is he really?
Yeah, I was just told by that. But
Okay, I'll take your word. You know, it might be right. I don't know.
the Spirit inspired my thoughts.
The Spirit inspired your thoughts. That in your web, being on the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
Okay. Chuck Smith states, quote, you can't, now by the way, that's improper writing for when you're writing a report. You're not supposed to use contractions, but he does it in his down-to-earth homiletic style. He says can't instead of cannot. You can't overestimate the importance of the book of Daniel. The book of Revelation would be almost impossible to understand without the prophecies of Daniel. Jesus quoted exclusively from Daniel in the Olivet Discourse. So in other words, everything prophetically that Jesus quotes in the Olivet Discourse comes from which book? Daniel. This is the book that we are studying today. This should really be exciting you. And Oscar, I want to see more excitement on your face. That's better. And just because you're sitting in the back, don't think I'm not keeping my eye on you, okay? Okay, Daniel clearly reveals both Christ and Antichrist, although he doesn't use that term, Antichrist. Only one person in the Bible uses the term Antichrist. Anybody know who that is?
The Christ.
Huh?
Jesus.
No. Is it Paul or is it John? Is it who?
Nothing.
Anybody? John who?
John the Baptist.
Huh?
No.
John Apostle, right? His last name's Apostle. Okay, so in the book of Daniel, Antichrist is identified as the little horn, Daniel chapter 7, 8, who sets up the abomination of desolation, or the abomination which makes it desolate. Okay. Let's take a look at the date and the author, okay? And with that, we are going to take a 10 or 15 minute break, okay? Oh, by the way, this is the book of Daniel. This is Prophecy 101, and this is April the 13th. Okay. We are looking at the date and the author. And first of all, we're going to look at the conservative view of the book of Daniel. I hope being in this class, you will understand that I promote the conservative view of the date of Daniel. Daniel was compiled around 536 BC. Daniel describes historical events during his life from 605 to 537 BC. In other words, for a period of about 70 years. Does anybody know? 70 years, does that ring a bell with anybody?
70-year exile.
70-year exile. That's correct. Okay. Let's look at the author. Jesus identifies Daniel as the author of the book of Daniel. That in itself should settle the question, who wrote the book of Daniel? Jesus states 2 times that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. If you disagree with Jesus, you have other problems besides wondering who wrote the book of Daniel. Much more serious problems than just knowing about the author of the book. So Daniel identifies himself as the author in Daniel chapter 8, verse 15, verse 27, chapter 9, verse 2, chapter 10, verse 2, and verse 7, chapter 12, verses 4 and 5. In other words, Daniel identifies himself as the author of the book numerous times. So let's take a look at Daniel's birth and captivity. Daniel's birth was prior to Josiah's Reformation in 621 BC. The fact that he was among the first selection of Jewish captives taken to Babylon in 605 BC by Nebuchadnezzar indicates that he claimed considerable social standing. In other words, Daniel was a socialite. He lived in the upper crust of Judean society. Daniel was of royal birth. He was good looking and possessed a keen mind. How do we know? Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Nebuchadnezzar only took not only the smartest, but the best looking. And of course, Daniel was one of those. So in order to be taken by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC, while he was, by the way, he was either a brand new king or he was still General Nebuchadnezzar, but he took literally the cream of the crop of Jerusalem. They're the ones that he took to Babylon. The purpose that he took them to Babylon for was to show that if he was going to rule Judea as a vassal state of Babylon, he was getting local people, in other words, the smartest people, and he's going to train them to be good Babylonians and then come back possibly to rule in Judea. If, of course, Judea would have been an obedient vassal state, of course, which we know that they weren't. So, anyway, he must have been between 15 and 17 years old in 605 BC. Okay. When he goes to Babylon, where does Daniel go to college?
Memphis.
That's Moses. Moses went to the University of Memphis, but Daniel went to the University of Babylon. Okay.
Duh.
Okay. It was a trick question. Okay. So anyway, part of the process of when you were going to be trained in Babylon was part of the brainwashing technique, part of making into, like, you have to realize they go into school and they're saying, we are going to make you a new man. So the first thing we're going to do is change your name. Okay? We'll get rid of that Jewish name and we're going to give you a Babylonian name. And we are going to call you Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar. Forget Daniel. From now on, you are Belteshazzar. Pronounced Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar. Okay. It's a strong, like a TS sound. Yeah, kind of like in this word. How do you say that? Right? Okay. It's this Hebrew letter right here. Okay. It's a tzadeh. Okay. It's a TS sound. Okay. If you can think tsetse fly, you can handle this. Okay. Or bar mitzvah. Okay. Same letter. Okay. So Belteshazzar, meaning Bel's prince or prince whom Bel favors. Okay. I'm sorry, what? The meaning of his name is Bel's prince. Let's see. Okay. See? So he was given a pretty regal name, right? Bel's prince, okay? Or prince whom Bel favors. So Daniel is going to receive an intensive 3 years of Babylonian education to learn, quote, the language and literature of the Chaldeans. That's in Daniel chapter 1, verse 4. Daniel was probably made a eunuch. I guess you'll go ahead and fill in this. To be a eunuch literally means like to be castrated, okay? And some Bible scholars believe Daniel was, others believe that he wasn't. But if Chuck Swindoll says he was, he's from Houston, Texas, I believe it. Okay, you can take it to the bank. So anyway, the word that's actually used, it's the word saris, okay? Saris, it's a Hebrew word, and it means eunuch, but it's from an unused root meaning to castrate, and thus a minister of state. Typically, if a high official was going to be in charge of the king's harem or something like that, in order so that the king would be able to trust him or something like along those lines, they would put a eunuch there. Then they wouldn't have to worry about his many wives being molested in the harem. That was the main reason back then. But another reason was that with Daniel being a young boy, if he is turned into a eunuch, if you think about what young men would say, typically think about when they're 17, 18, 19, or on, rather than befuddle their mind with thoughts of the opposite sex, with that desire taken away, it leaves more of their time to spend on their studies and their future careers and stuff like that. So again, that was one of the main reasons why they did that. So King Nebuchadnezzar personally examined or tested Daniel and his three Jewish associates, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and found them to be without equal. They far surpassed the wisdom and knowledge of all the Babylonian magicians and astrologers. Again, Daniel chapter 1, verses 17 to 20. So in other words, remember earlier in the book, there was a test. Remember, God literally gave Daniel a test. Remember, all the people from all the various countries, they were given the choicest, best Babylonian food available because Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to have the very best. But it just so turned out that the meats and things would have been sacrificed to idols, and Daniel and his three associates determined that they were going to be obedient to the dietary laws and other laws, that were in the books of Moses. And so they determined that they were not going to partake of the Babylonian food. So remember, you can remember the story where Daniel doesn't get up there and protest. What does he do? He very wisely, with lots of wisdom, talks to the head person and explains the situation, and then tells the official who is in charge of them that if I am going to not eat the king's foods, if we don't look better in 10 days, eating our own special diet, then we'll eat the king's food. Basically, that's the test that Daniel gave him. And of course, it says in your Bible, that Daniel and his three friends ate vegetables, but yet they looked sharper, better, and more clearer than all the rest of the people who were in this University of Babylon. So they were allowed to stick with their menus. So right off the bat, you can see that God was giving Daniel wisdom. Anybody know what wisdom is? Greek, Sophia, Hakma in Hebrew. He's given wisdom. Anybody know what that is?
The fear of the Lord.
That's the beginning of wisdom, but it doesn't tell you what wisdom is. What is wisdom?
Knowledge put into practice.
Knowledge put into practice. Yeah, it's like, for instance, you go through this school, and you know how I know you're right? Delilah is nodding her head in agreement. Okay, if she's right, I know you're right. Okay. 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 So it's knowledge put into action. So in other words, by the way, what does knowledge do? If you just come here to this school for knowledge, what does it do?
Puffs up.
It puffs up. It swells your head, okay? Which is something you got to watch out for. Wisdom There's a large dose of humility that goes along with wisdom so that you are able to use the knowledge that you've been given and use it effectively, okay? What's another word for wisdom or prudence? Prudence is a good word, but what does prudent mean?
Slow to react.
It's a good guess, but it's wrong. Okay. Anybody got an idea? What is prudent? What does it mean to be prudent? Now the serpent was more prudent than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. What's the word that they use in English? Crafty, cunning, okay? So in other words, you can use that in a good sense. You can be crafty or cunning or prudent or wise, okay? They're all synonyms of each other. So anyway, they far surpass the wisdom and knowledge of all the Babylonian magicians and astrologers, okay? These intellectual abilities were given to them by God, according to Daniel 1:17. So now, let's take a look at Daniel's character. What do we mean by character? Character. Does character matter?
Yes.
Yeah. Does it matter for a Christian?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. From the time that Daniel was 15 until the end of a long, fruitful life for God, Daniel purposed in his heart to obey God's laws. Okay? So in other words, in Daniel 1:8, Proverbs 4:23, and not to compromise the divine covenant, which was given in Exodus chapter 34, which would provoke God's jealousy. So in other words, Daniel and his friends purposed in their minds. If you were in the South, they would say, I have a mind to obey the Lord. That's what they would say. At least in Florida. I don't know about Texas. But Florida through Alabama, through Louisiana, they would say, I have a mind to obey the Lord. Okay. Okay. Throughout Daniel's 85 plus year lifespan, he remained true to Israel's God. By the way, Daniel is one of the few persons in the Bible where there's not a single sin listed for him. But was Daniel a sinner?
Yeah. Yes.
How do you know?
Because everyone's a sinner.
Everyone's a sinner. We know that from Romans, all have sinned, all fall short of the glory of God, right? How else do we know? Daniel chapter 9, remember when he's praying, he himself states that he's a sinner. Okay. Toward the end of Daniel's life, his envious Persian enemies, okay, could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Daniel chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. In other words, he was so goody two-shoes, so straight, that when his enemies tried to find fault with him, and by the way, when your enemies are trying to find fault with you and they can't find anything, you're standing up to a pretty good test, because if there's something wrong with you, I guarantee you, your critics will find it. So then they say, well, there's only one way that we can get this guy. We have to attack him where he worships his God. That's the only way that we can attack him. So anyway, Daniel served. Let's look at Daniel's exemplary service in government. Daniel was a civil servant. In other words, he worked for the government. Daniel served as an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Daniel chapter 5, and as a high-ranking governor. In other words, he was one of the 3 top men in the Persian Empire during the reign under Darius the Persian. Daniel 6:2. Daniel served from about 602 BC to 539 BC, over 63 years of government service. Though possibly retired when Belshazzar was king of Babylon. Remember, he was set aside for a while. He was already an old man, but remember, they called him back when Belshazzar, remember, they were in a drunken stupor in this feast that they were having. The Medes and the Persians were surrounding the walls of Babylon. And they were so confident that, remember, Belshazzar said, bring out the implements of the Jewish temple, and let's drink a toast to our gods out of the golden cups that we can get out of, the instruments that were used for worship in the Jewish temple. And so as he was drinking out of a wine goblet or something of that, he was using a glass, using it as a wine goblet. And as he was doing that, remember, all of a sudden he sees a hand writing on the wall that just appears and starts writing on the wall. And it says in the text, if you have a King James, translations are great, right? Mm-hmm. It says, as he saw this, it said that it's like great fear overtakes him as one knee smote against the other. And literally, like, his loins were loosed at that point. Okay. So it's nice. Huh?
Does that mean he pooped his pants?
That's exactly what it means. Yeah. That's the. Remember when I did the Greek class? Remember, like, in the Bible, there's a thing called the poop factor, where you have to change the language so that it makes it appropriate, for all the audience in the class. Because lots of times God can be very graphic when he's describing things, but it's not sensible for mixed audiences or for, say, children or something like that. And so you kind of clean up the language in the translation. And so, like, you're just making the translation fuzzy so that you don't really quite know what he's saying. Okay, so loosing the loins of kings is one of those things. By the way, that's in Isaiah too, where loosing the loins of kings is one of the things that says God does. In other words, he brings great fear into them, and that's kind of like what they want to get across. But as Oscar said, he told you what it literally means. Okay. So anyway. Daniel was an interpreter of dreams and visions. Remember, of course, the handwriting on the wall. Daniel is retired. Remember, that's the train of thought we're on. Daniel is retired. And remember, the queen mother comes out because first Belshazzar calls out the magicians and the Chaldeans. They couldn't interpret it. Remember, anybody remember what's written on the wall? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Wade, Wade, your king has been found Wade, wanting, and it is being divided between the Medes and the Persians. Okay, that's what was. And remember, he had to call Daniel back into service, but Belshazzar didn't do that. The queen mother did. Nebuchadnezzar's wife, the queen mother, she reminded Belshazzar about Daniel and how Nebuchadnezzar greatly relied upon Daniel. Daniel comes in. Remember, he's offered to be third in the kingdom. Remember, Daniel says, keep your gifts. Maybe he's thinking to himself, it'll only be until the morning anyway because you're going to be overthrown. But remember, he says, that by morning time, the kingdom will be taken by the Medes and the Persians. Anybody remember how that happened? Gabrias and Gadatas, two deserters from the Babylonian army, had gone to Cyrus, the general and king of Persia, and they come up with a plan that shows them how they can take the city of Babylon, which was considered impregnable at that time. Remember, the Euphrates River ran right directly underneath it. In other words, they had a fresh water supply year-round. They had farmlands inside the city. The walls were, over 100 feet high, actually over 300 feet high, towers 100 feet that even towered above the walls. And there was just no way to get into the city. However, the Medes and the Persians dammed the Euphrates River several miles upstream, diverted the river, and then the Medes and the Persians marched underneath the gate in the riverbed and took the city without a fight. Basically, they put out an ultimatum: anybody that leaves their house will be shot on sight. No, say shot with an arrow or something like that. Belshazzar was, of course, killed, and the kingdom. Basically, Babylon was under the control of the Medes and the Persians before the general population of Babylon even knew what had happened. They didn't even realize what had happened. So that's kind of like what happened. That's from the handwriting on the wall that Daniel interpreted. So anyway, Daniel was an interpreter of dreams and visions. Daniel was able to get a good start in government administration because he gained a reputation first as an interpreter of other men's visions. Remember, how did he get high in government service? He interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But he did more than interpret the dream. He also told Nebuchadnezzar what he dreamed. Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar says, I don't trust you magicians or you Chaldeans, because I'll tell you what the dream is and you're going to make something up. So you got to tell me what I dreamed. And if you can't tell me what I dreamed, then it says, I know you're all phonies. I'm going to kill every one of you. Basically, that's
That's what Pharaoh did with Joseph and all those guys, right?
except that Joseph didn't have to tell him. Joseph didn't have to tell Pharaoh what he dreamed. He told him what the dream meant, but he didn't have to come up and tell him what the dream was. Okay. So with the Nebuchadnezzar, the standard got a little harder. So anyway, after that, he had visions of his own in which he predicted the future triumph of the Messianic kingdom. That's literally chapters 7 through 12. Okay. So anyway, that's the conservative view. So if you believe in prophecy, and if you believe that prophecy is predictive by nature, it's one of the, like we're in the prophets, and typically when you think you're a prophet, you don't think preaching or one who exhorting, you think of one who predicts the future and predicts it accurately, correct? That's what you normally think of. So that brings us to the next section, Daniel and the Critic's Den. Anybody familiar with that title? It's actually, I borrowed it from Josh McDowell's book, Daniel in the Critic's Den. Anybody know what it's a play off of? Daniel in the Lion's Den. Okay, Daniel in the Critic's Den. Okay. So anyway, he wrote a book, back in the late 70s, early 80s, Daniel and the Critic's Den. In other words, he formulates all the arguments that the critics have against the book of Daniel. And by the way, when I was a new believer and I was teaching a Bible study in Spain, I ended up with a guy that had some Bible knowledge in my class, and he started throwing out all of this liberal type stuff. I didn't even know what a liberal was back then. And he started saying, no, Daniel was not written, and he didn't write the book. It was written in 163 BC. And it floored me. I didn't have answers for all these arguments that he was giving. So it's like God used this in my life, to humble me, and it made me search out for answers on, like, I knew he was wrong, but how do you refute it? Because people just want to believe the worst sometimes, especially if you don't want to believe the scripture. You want to find things wrong with it and then kind of like document it. So anyway, in the Illustrated Bible Dictionary, Part 1, it states, quote, I got to read this quote, modern critical scholarship is practically unanimous in its rejection of the book, the book of Daniel, as a 6th century BC document written by Daniel. In other words, if you were in liberal Christianity, almost to a man, they are going to deny that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Doesn't matter that Christ said that he wrote it. None of that matters. It doesn't matter that the book itself says it was written by Daniel. They don't believe it. So almost to a man, they will say they reject the book of Daniel as having been written by Daniel. Critics claim that the book was compiled by an unknown author about 165 BC. It is further claimed that the book was written to encourage faithful Jews in their conflict with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Remember, in other words, the person who later on is going to be identified as the little horn and also as the future Antichrist. Okay. Dwight Pentecost. Does anybody know who Dwight Pentecost is? See if you're paying attention from this morning. Where does he teach? Texas, but where? Dallas Theological Seminary. The home of Dr. John Walvoord. Walvoord and Zuck, are the textbook for this. Basically, it's written by professors at Dallas Theological Seminary. Formerly the school's turning in their belief system, so they're not as fundamental as they used to be, but back then, much more fundamental. Dwight Pentecost states, critics reject an early date for the writing of Daniel mainly because they reject predictive prophecy. So if you don't believe, if you're a naturalist and you don't believe in predictive prophecy because there's no God out there, then obviously Daniel was written after the fact. How else could he get all those facts right? It had to have been written after the fact. Remember I mentioned that Daniel chapter 11 itself has over like 111, 113 distinct prophecies or predictions in it. How could Daniel know? Daniel couldn't know that if he lived before time, because of course, how could he possibly know the future? So obviously it was written after the fact. And so then they draw their conclusion, and then they got to find reasons why that is true. Okay? So anyway, this is important for you to know, because if you take the conservative view that Daniel wrote this book, you are in the minority. Most of Christendom does not believe that. So anyway, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states, quote, there has always been a wide diversity of opinion about the whole question of integrity of authorship. Many scholars have denied the possibility of a predictive element in prophecy, especially the sort of detailed narration found in Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 11. Okay, unquote. So take a look at some critical arguments, and I just listed these from Walvoord and Zuck, the textbook that all of you guys, I hope, even if you didn't do it for this class, buy this commentary on the Old Testament. And of course there's a slightly smaller, less thick volume for the New Testament. It is, if you want a commentary for the entire Bible, this is a really good commentary. Why is this a good commentary in the Old Testament? Because one of their number one sources, if you look in almost every single book here, in their bibliography, they are going to quote extensively from Keil and Delitzsch's commentary of the Old Testament. Anybody know who they are? Okay. During the break, I'm going to bring in a couple of volumes. Okay, I'll just grab some out of David's office. Okay. But anyway, probably the commentary of commentaries for the Old Testament was made by the German scholars, like in the middle of the, not last century, but the one before that, or say early in the 1900s or in the 1800s. The commentary that people typically, all the commentators today, they always go back to Keil and Delitzsch, their commentary of the Old Testament. So if you become pastors or something like that, or if you look at almost any pastor's office here, you will see a 10-volume set of Keil and Delitzsch's commentary of the Old Testament. It is just a work that is good to have in your library. And I'll show you a couple of volumes next show. By the way, I have two sets. I have the old set, which is like an old black volumes. By the way, my set is translated into English. Why do I have one translated into English? Because I do not speak German. But if you speak German, if you're fortunate enough to speak German, you can read it in the original. And if you read it in the English too, as well as the German, you can, wow, that's a pretty good translation. They translated the German and the English really well. So like Delilah, you could do that. You could say, well, yeah, I might say that in English, but maybe I'd say it this way. Maybe you could translate it yourself, come up with your own translation into another language. By the way, why did theologians always learn German last century? Because the scholars were from Germany back in that day. So if you were going to get a good theological education, not only did you learn Greek and Hebrew, you had to learn German. And then you had to spend like a year or two in Germany so that you could study in country, the original sources in the original languages. Just a push to show that we here in America, we didn't come up with all of this stuff ourselves. I mean, there's a lot of centuries of good scholarship that came from other countries that we built on here in this country. So anyway,
What's the scholar's name?
Keil and Delitzsch. I'm going to bring in a couple of copies just so you can see it. And then I'm going to let you look at their names so that you can pronounce it for me correctly for the whole class. I did that in a couple of my other classes with a member, Anna Dietrich, and Melanie Hunkel. It was She corrected me as Hunkel, not Hunkel. Okay, they would pronounce it for me correctly, and I'm going to let Delilah do that too when I bring a volume in, because I say Kyle and Dalish. That's not how you really say it, but I want you to hear how you really say it. Okay, J. Dwight Pentecost. Who here knows who J. Dwight Pentecost is? Have you heard that name before? Kenny.
No.
Okay, this is the third time I brought it up this morning. He's from Texas. Where did he teach? Dallas Theological Seminary. In other words, he was an associate with Charles Ryrie. Y'all heard of Charles Ryrie? The Ryrie Study Bible. Okay. Charles Swindoll, Hal Lindsey. I mean, a lot of good people. Howard Hendricks. Anybody hear of Howard Hendricks? Usually when you see courses on marriage, you know, and all sorts of, and books on teaching, the 8 rules of the teacher or the student or something like that, they all refer back to Dr. Howard Hendricks of Dallas Theological Seminary. Okay. Dwight Pentecost states, quote, critics reject an early date for the writing of Daniel mainly because they reject predictive prophecy. So in other words, so I'm stressing over and over again, why do the critics reject Daniel? Because they don't believe there is such a thing as predictive prophecy. In other words, they don't believe there's a God who reveals secrets. The international, yes.
Do they try to, since that's their stance, do they try to refute all the prophets, and do they just simply not believe any of the prophets, or is it specifically Daniel?
They target specifically, and remember, who empowers the critics from the spiritual? Satan. So, for instance, Jesus quoted when Jesus was refuting Satan, Jesus quoted exclusively from Deuteronomy. Aha! What book does Satan try to refute more than any other book? Deuteronomy. Because Jesus he quoted exclusively from Deuteronomy when he countered Satan, when Satan was tempting him, you know, in the wilderness. The book of Daniel again, the book of Isaiah. Remember we said the critics state there couldn't have been one Isaiah. There was at least 2, possibly 3 different Isaiahs. Remember when we talked about that? In other words, the critics don't believe what was stated. Remember we quoted out of the Gospel of John because it's like the Holy Spirit was anticipating what the critics were going to say. The critics said that the writer of Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 was one Isaiah, and the guy that wrote chapters 40 through 66 was a different Isaiah. What does Jesus do? He says Isaiah states, and then he quotes something that Isaiah said very specifically, and then he said, again Isaiah states, or he further states, and then he quotes from the second part of the book, but he says, this same Isaiah. So again, it comes down to, do you believe what Jesus said, or do you believe what the critics say? Again, you know, quoting Dr. Chuck Missler, formerly of Calvary Chapel. That was Chuck Smith's most famous Bible teacher under him. He said, if you don't believe what Jesus said, you have far greater problems than knowing who the author of Isaiah was. If you don't believe what Jesus said, that's a far greater problem than being critical of Isaiah. And you all see why, of course, right? Because if you don't believe what Jesus said, you're not a believer. In other words, you're not saved. So you have a far greater problem than who wrote the book of Isaiah or, say, the book of Daniel. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states, quote, there has always been a wide diversity of opinion about the whole question of integrity of authorship. Many scholars have denied the possibility of a predictive element in prophecy, especially the sort of detailed narration found in Daniel chapter 8 and 11. And I intentionally have said that twice because I can't stress how important that is. So let's look at some critical arguments, again, taken from Walvoord and Zuck. That's where we kind of left off. I have come full circle, and now we're back to the notes again. Number 1, and I only took some of the arguments. And by the way, I just state the argument, and I give you an extremely quick refutation, okay? Not reputation, but refutation, okay? Several Persian and Greek words in the book indicate that it must have been written much later than the 6th century BC. In other words, scholars look at documents and they say, oh, these were words that are common in, say, 165 BC, not the 6th century BC. So obviously, this was written during 165 BC. So the rebuttal. Here's a rebuttal to that argument. Archaeology reveals commerce existed between Greece and Babylon even before Daniel's day, and they were using those words. A little offshoot of this argument is the instruments in Daniel chapter 3. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar says they've got to bow down to a 66-foot high golden statue, or 90-foot high statue. And remember, it says when the harp, the lyre, and the other musical instrument is played, you must bow down and worship. Turns out that the names of those instruments are not Babylonian instruments. They're Persian and they're Greek. So in other words, when you have something in one culture and you take it to another culture, oftentimes you carry the same word from, when a country invents something and then it's put into another country, oftentimes you just take that word and you use the same word. Like, for instance, it used to be, the old Soviet Union, say modern-day Russia. They used to say that they were the first to invent a lot of things, when everybody knew that other countries had invented these things. And they used to say that they invented the radio. Okay, the radio is not a Russian word. It's transliterated, of course, from the English into Russian. So they made the statement that we invented the radio, but why are you calling it then by an English name? So, in other words, this is exactly the same argument. It shows that there was commerce between Greece and Medo-Persia just because another empire was the dominating world power at that time doesn't mean that they traded with somebody else. You all understand the argument? Okay. So just like we here are, we live in the United States, and at the moment, like say if we call ourselves a world power today, at the moment we are that today. But would anybody deny that we don't get imports from other countries? Would anybody deny that? If you drive a Toyota or something like that, or a Datsun, or an Audi, or a Volkswagen, or something like that, you have to understand these are not American products. But they're all over the roads, aren't they? Although I got to admit today that the way the world is going, parts are made from all the different places in the world today. Anyway, number 2, apocalyptic literature appears in Daniel when most apocalyptic literature appeared in the Maccabean era. In other words, Judas Maccabeus around 165 BC. And so the critics say, since most apocalyptic literature was written during that time, it couldn't have been written by Daniel 4 centuries earlier. So that's their second argument. Rebuttal. Apocalyptic literature is found in the 6th century prophet Ezekiel. Historical errors such as Nebuchadnezzar was not the father of Belshazzar, as indicated in Daniel chapter 5 to verse 11, verse 13, verse 18, verse 22. Rebuttal. A royal successor to the throne was called a son, even if he had no blood relationship to an earlier king. In other words, it's just the way they did things back then. Argument number 4. Daniel did not use the name Yahweh, but other writers did in that era, in the 6th century BC. So Daniel must have been written at a later date, because he doesn't use the name Yahweh or Yahweh. Jehovah, in other words. What's the rebuttal to that? Daniel chapter 9 uses the name Yahweh 8 times. Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, verse 4, verse 8, verse 10, verses 13 and 14, and verse 20. But by the way, how do the critics get by with that? Remember, they say that Daniel was written they use their other arguments to show that Daniel was written in 165 BC. Okay, argument number 5. Daniel records advanced theology of angels and the resurrection of the dead, which necessitates a late post-exilic date for the book. Because Daniel talked about angels, because he talked about the resurrection, they said it must have been written around 165 BC. Rebuttal. The critics overlook the fact that angels are frequently referred to throughout Israel's long history. Resurrection is mentioned in Psalm 16:10. David wrote Psalm 16, 1000 BC. Isaiah 26:19. Job chapter 14, written sometime after Abraham. All these books greatly predate Daniel, and they talked about angels. Remember in Genesis, they talk about angels, chapters 18 and 19. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. How many of you here, like say you plan to be pastors or teachers or something like that in your Christian career?
I guess.
You're going to be a teacher someday, you think? Teach the Bible someday in a church, or do you think you'll teach ladies groups and stuff like that, Dalila?
Maybe.
Okay, so there's a possibility for every one of you, right? Okay, you can go through any pastor's office, say, I'll say like senior pastor. For instance, if you go to David Guzik's office, I did, okay, and I pulled out 4 volumes of Kyle and Delitzsch's commentary of the Old Testament. If you go into Keith Fortenberry's office, not only does he have this, but he has the retranslation of Kyle and Delitzsch's commentary of the Old Testament. It comes like in a lighter brown copy, and it's 10 volumes, but the English in it has been updated. And I say if you're fortunate enough, you can actually read it in the original German. And you will discover when you look at, say, more modern books, if you go into the bibliography of virtually any Old Testament book, if it's a scholarly work, in other words, the scholars are basing their research on good sources and stuff, you will not fail to see this commentary quoted. Okay, this is like when I first became a Christian, I was told early on in my ministry that you must get a copy of Kyle and Delitzsch's commentary of the Old Testament. It was just a standard. If you went to like Dallas Theological Seminary, you had to work out of this almost exclusively. In other words, this is like it was virtually one of the most scholarly works up until this time of the work that was done on the Old Testament. The accuracy is very conservative, it's very biblical. You read a lot of the stuff in it, and except if they don't use modern examples, when you use examples, they're not going to have examples of airplanes and jets and stuff like that. They weren't invented yet, okay? But you're going to discover that as far as accuracy, if you want accuracy in your biblical studies, you will purchase this commentary. Okay, and I can't stress that enough. I doubt if you will ever read it through, but when you're doing research, you can use it as a reference, to go back to it. Well, what do these scholars think? Okay, they were high-ranking, top-notch scholars, and like I say, every conservative seminary that I know of in the United States uses them. Like I say, just browse in David Guzik's office, browse in Keith Fortenberry's, and you're going to see there's a copy of this 10-volume set. Okay, that's my plug, for sources. So, like, since all of you plan to be teachers, then I would highly recommend that you purchase this commentary. You can't go wrong if you do that. David Guzik is continually quoting Spurgeon. Okay, Spurgeon, of course, was around the same time that these guys were. Okay. By the way, has anybody ever heard me quote Spurgeon? No. Who do I quote continually? Who? John MacArthur, J. Vernon McGee, John MacArthur a lot. I quote John MacArthur because I went to the Master's Seminary, so I quote him a lot. I learned to quote him a lot because if I quoted him and I turned in a paper, no professor would ever dare question what I said. Oh, well, our president, John MacArthur, said it must be right. Okay. So let's take a look at the historical background and setting. Okay. First of all, let's look at the language. Daniel was written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. The MacArthur Study Bible notes, now who am I quoting? MacArthur. Not McGee, okay. By the way, McGee came out with his own study Bible too. a quote, Daniel chapter 2, verse 4b through chapter 7, verse 28, which prophetically describes the course of Gentile world history, was originally and appropriately written in Aramaic, the contemporary language of international business, unquote. Okay, so let's look at some contemporary prophets with Daniel. What does contemporary mean? Who was prophesying at the same time as Daniel? Okay, first of all, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. They were all contemporaries with Daniel. So anyway, let's take a chronology of events in the book of Daniel. In 612 BC, Babylon and Media destroyed Nineveh. Does anybody know what was Nineveh? The capital of Assyria, correct? Okay. In 609 BC, Assyria sought help from Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II led an army to join Assyria. In 609 BC, the Judean king Josiah tried to stop the Egyptian army at Megiddo. The Judean army was defeated and Josiah was killed. Remember, he was the last good king of the southern kingdom. He was killed by the Egyptian army. In 605 BC, May and June of 605 BC, General Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt in the Battle of Carchemish, or Carchemish. Okay. Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, died, and in August of 605, Nebuchadnezzar was crowned king of Babylon. By the way, it was Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, who actually rebelled against Assyria. Babylon was a province of Assyria. That province rebelled, and eventually Nabopolassar got other allies, and then they broke away from the Assyrian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years, 605 BC to 562 BC. Guy was around for a long time. In September 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem. Daniel and his companions were carried captive to Babylon in the first of 3 deportations. In 597 BC, in response to Jehoiakim's rebellion, who's Jehoiakim? Jehoiakim. He's who? King of Judah, right? Okay. And son of Jehoiakim, right? Jehoiakim is the son of Jehoiakim. Okay. I tell you what, when we get to the book of Obadiah and Hosea, Joel, and Amos, when I'm giving you the kings, I'm explaining who some of the kings were in the north and the south, and it really gets complicated when the king of Israel is Jehoram, and the king of Judah is Jehoram, and they're cousins. They're both wicked, but when the Bible goes back and forth between the two, because it's so confusing, they have to use the nickname for one king when they're referring to the other. So if they're referring to King Jehoram of Israel, they'll call the guy from Judah Joram. If they're talking about King Jehoram of Judah, they'll say the king of Israel is Joram. And for us, if you don't really study it, it gets even more confusing, because they were reigning at the same time, and they were both, of course, related to Ahab, King Ahab, Queen Jezebel. Anyway, in 597 BC, in response to Jehoiakim's rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar defeated Jerusalem and brought 10,000 captives to Babylon. A little later in this paper, I'm going to explain why did he take these captives. Remember, he took a specific group of captives to Babylon. Okay. Did anybody want to venture to guess why he took these people captive?
Well, they were like nobility kind of, right?
Well, that was in the first captivity when Daniel and his friends were taken. The nobility was taken. Royalty and nobility were taken. In this instance, it's the craftsmen, the carpenters, the stone workers, the steel workers, in other words, people who were very gifted, in the trades. They were taken. Anybody want to venture why?
For slaves?
No.
So that they could have them, but also that Israel wouldn't have them.
Okay, I'll answer that a little later on. I want you all to think about it. Max, do you have an opinion?
Help the economic.
That's close. Anybody want to think about it? You know, why these 10,000 were taken captive to Babylon. Okay. Ezekiel and King Jehoiakim were among this group. Remember we talked about that in Ezekiel chapter 1 and 2 Kings chapter 24, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Okay. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar led a long siege against Jerusalem. In August of 586 BC, in other words, like 2 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple burned down, and most of the Jews not killed were deported to Babylon. King Zedekiah was blinded and deported to Babylon. Okay, that was the third deportation. In 539 BC, Cyrus, king of Persia, overthrew Babylon and established the Medo-Persian Empire. In 538 BC, Cyrus issued a decree to allow the Jews of Babylon to return to Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, the book of Ezra chapter 1. Okay. And about 50,000 Jews returned to the land and began work on the temple. So in keeping with Daniel's prayer of Daniel chapter 9 verses 4 through 19, in other words, this is like God's answer to that prayer. In 515 BC, the temple was completed. Okay, why do I go through all of this history? It's during the life of Daniel. Okay, this is what was happening during his life. In other words, Daniel didn't reside in a Bible college or a Bible university. In other words, these are the events that were going along in Daniel's life. So if Daniel was taken as a 15 to 17-year-old, say he was 17 in 606 BC. In 601 BC, he's going to be in his early 20s. He will have already been educated in Babylon and is already pretty high up in the echelon of being in a group of advisors. In other words, at that time, Daniel was, say, a part of the Chaldeans and the magicians. In other words, he was in that group of quote-unquote scholars that gave counsel to high officials. Daniel was already in that group. So let's take a look at theological themes. Okay, in Babylon, this is a quote, by the way. In Babylon, Daniel received God's word concerning successive stages of Gentile world domination through the centuries until the greatest conqueror, Messiah, would put down all Gentile worship or lordship. He then will defeat all foes and raise his covenant people to blessing in his glorious millennial kingdom. And I'm quoting, of course, anybody want to guess? The MacArthur Study Bible. Okay, MacArthur Study Bible. A note of humility is to not plagiarize your sources, but to give credit to the people who actually said it. Okay. So when you're eventually when you teach in the future, be a respectable teacher and quote your sources. In other words, name who your sources are, so that people will realize that it teaches them, your students, that, oh, by the way, your teacher had to study too. Okay. It's intellectually honest. If I would have plagiarized a source at the Master's College, for the first infraction, it was suspension for a year. At the second infraction, I would have been kicked out of the school. So again, they take plagiarism very seriously. It scared me enough to where I decided to do a project instead of a thesis. Because how often do you quote a source and say you know the source backwards and forwards, and then all of a sudden it becomes a part of your own knowledge. And it's part of your knowledge, but yet if you write it out, like some professor might say, well, he's quoting so-and-so. He's plagiarizing, he didn't give credit for it. And sometimes I make jokes about writers in the Bible that do that. I used to say that the Apostle Paul, without giving any reference to where he got the information, Paul plagiarizes the prophet Joel when he states, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. He plagiarized the prophet Joel. He didn't take, in other words, he didn't give credit to the prophet Joel as his source. By the way, Peter was guilty of the same infraction, Acts chapter 2. Peter said in that great sermon to all the converts, people he was preaching to, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Again, quoting Joel 2:32. Without giving credit to where he got his reference. Yeah.
Was giving reference a common thing back in that time? Would they say, as our, I don't know, church fathers said, or Isaiah said, would they quote and outright say, Isaiah said this? Was it like common for them?
Well, let me say one person who did. Jesus did. Spoken by Daniel the prophet. Isaiah said this same, later again, this same Isaiah says. Jesus quoted his sources.
Okay.
So if Jesus did it, why wouldn't Paul or... this is a joke that I make. Don't take me seriously. Okay. But if he was at the Master's College and they would have done that, they would have been kicked out of school for not naming their source. Okay. That's part of the joke. I hope you understand that. And Delilah's yawning, so I know I'm boring her with my jokes, okay? Okay. Theological themes. Okay, we've already looked at that. The second theme, God has sovereign control over the affairs of all rulers and nations in their final replacement with the true king. He sovereignly allowed Gentiles to dominate Israel. So, for instance, when Israel was being judged, Babylon ruled from 605 BC to 539 BC. Medo-Persia ruled from 539 to 331 BC. Greece from 331 to 146 BC. And Rome from 146 BC to AD 476. By the way, that's the western leg of the Roman Empire. The eastern leg of the Roman Empire, remember the name was changed from Rome to the Byzantine Empire, and they ruled until about 1450. And finally, when the Turks, the Ottoman Turks came in and destroyed them, that was the official end of the eastern leg of the Roman Empire. So the eastern leg, and like from everybody here except Bezu, is from some country in the western leg of the Roman Empire, and we are very provincial, and we say, well, obviously that was the strongest and the best leg. Rome was their capital, but remember the Byzantine Empire lasted for an extra 1,000 years longer than the western leg. So it kind of, in all humility, it should put us in our place, because like typically, even when we talk about the end times, we talk about the Antichrist. Well, a man that intelligent, that wise, that all-powerful, he must be from the western leg of the Roman Empire. And so typically, you'll hear he's the Pope, or he's going to be a German, or he's going to be from the British Isles or something like that. You'll hear that in the West, but if you're from the East, say east of Mediterranean, they're all saying that the Antichrist will come from the eastern leg of the Roman Empire, probably come from Syria or something like that. And if you do a lot of research on the end times, you'll notice that a lot of those scholars, they're placing the Antichrist as coming from somewhere in Syria, near Damascus or something like that, because you got to find a place where the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire all converged. And where is that? In some place like Lebanon or Syria. And that leaves out Germany, it leaves out Italy, it leaves out England, it leaves out the United States. I've read books, commentaries that obviously the Antichrist will come from the United States, because after all, we are the new Babylon. I've read, that's what, when you get away from a literal interpretation, you end up with these wild interpretations like that. It's very distressing to a lot of people in this country that our country's name is not mentioned in the Bible. Bezu's country is mentioned so many times, I can't even count the number of times it's mentioned. Germany is mentioned, but not under the name Germany. Anybody know the biblical name for Germany? It's the name of a woman, too. Gomer. Yeah, it's also the name for Germany, too. So anyway, but the United States, not even Texas is mentioned in the Bible. Okay, just so that you know, okay?
That's what you think.
Not, okay. Well, maybe it is, okay. Okay. So anyway, all the way to the second advent of Christ, Messiah is coming to rule the world in glory over all men, okay? So anyway, Daniel is also a display of God's sovereign power and will through miracles. So you're going to see the period of Daniel's reign, or Daniel's prophetic career, or career as a prime minister and leader in two successive world empires, was also one of the periods of miracles. There's three great periods of miracles in the Bible. During the time of Elijah and Elisha, okay? During the days of the Babylonian captivity, right before, and then of course during the time of Christ. Those are the three eras biblically where there's a lot of miracles going on.
What was the second one?
During the time of Daniel. Like you read through the book of Daniel, the handwriting on the wall, is that a miracle?
Yeah.
Daniel interpreting, not only interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but telling him what he actually dreamed, without having a tape recorder under Nebuchadnezzar's pillow, assuming that Nebuchadnezzar talked in his sleep. Okay. In other words, so interpreting dreams, Daniel chapter 2, 4, and 7, handwriting on the wall in Daniel's interpretation, chapter 5, protecting three men in the blazing furnace. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and off to bed we go? Remember they're cast into the fiery furnace? Okay. Oh, you caught that, huh? That's how you remember it, right? Did anybody else catch that? Huh? Abednego, off to bed we go. Okay, good. Finally, Cameron finally looked up. Okay, that's good. God's providential safety for Daniel in the lion's den. Remember, there's some strong angels there, with their mighty arms, gripping the lion's jaws and holding them shut. Probably like 8 or 9 angels down there, holding those jaws closed so they wouldn't have Daniel for breakfast or lunch or dinner or whatever. So let's take a look at the outline of Daniel, and I got my outline. It's adopted. It's not a direct copy, but it's adopted from the. Anybody want to care to guess? The MacArthur Study Bible. Okay. By the way, I could have. They all have outlines, and they're all different. So I choose one out of my Bible. It must be more accurate because it's actually in the Bible, right? Not really, right? It's commentary. Okay. The outline is not inspired, but the text is, okay. So number one, personal background of Daniel and his three friends, chapter 1 through verse 21. The prophetic history of the Gentiles, chapters 2 through 7. And then breaking that down, problems for Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 2, verse 1, all the way through 437. Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall, chapter 5. Daniel in the lion's den, chapter 6. Daniel's vision and interpretation of the four beasts and the Ancient of Days, chapters 7. And then the prophetic history of Israel, chapter 8, all the way through chapter 12, verse 13. And in chapter 8, it's the ram and the male goat. Chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. And then the last part, 70 weeks prophecy, chapter 9, verse 1 through 27. And then, of course, prophecy of Israel's humiliation and restoration. That's chapters 10 all the way through 12. That's the outline. Okay. By the way, why do I give outlines? Because if you want to understand a book, then outline breaks it down into bite-sized sections. What is the way to eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? Okay. I gave you, in this particular handout, a biography of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. I mean, a lot is said about this guy. Why is he important? Because, he's in the Bible a lot. And you might not know a whole lot of names in the Bible, but I would venture to say, being the Bible scholars that all of you are, I bet you've all heard of Nebuchadnezzar. Who has not heard of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon? Isaac? No, just kidding. Okay. Has anybody not heard of Nebuchadnezzar? Who has heard of Nebuchadnezzar? Raise your hand. Okay, not a finger, a hand. Okay. You've all heard of Nebuchadnezzar? How about you, Tony? You've doubly heard of him, huh? Cameron, have you? Okay. In Oregon, have they heard of Nebuchadnezzar in Oregon? Okay. Okay, even in Oregon. In Hawaii, okay, they've heard of Nebuchadnezzar. So he's a pretty famous guy, right? Okay. So let's take a look at who Nebuchadnezzar is, since he's in the Bible so much. Nebuchadnezzar, as I've already tried to show you, is an important man in the Bible. His name is mentioned in the Bible 91 times. 60 times as Nebuchadnezzar and 31 times as Nebuchadrezzar. In other words, let me write that up here so you want to make sure you get this. Anybody see the difference? What's different?
Apparently,
The what?
the N and the R.
Yeah, this letter right here. By the way, if you were an archaeologist and you were doing an archaeological dig, say in the old city of Babylon, and say you were one of the archaeologists that were digging up the and smoothing out, getting rid of all the debris out of the processional way. If you're doing that, you'd see these massive blocks in the city of in the processional way. By the way, that's a street. Okay, it's a very wide avenue. On every single one of these 3-foot square blocks, 1.5 square meters. Okay, it would say "to the glory of Marduk." Remember I mentioned this before, like the Jewish captives. There's 50,000 of them, and now they're going as captives into Babylon. God sends them to a place where there's idolatry. So God says, "You want to be an idolater? I will send you to an idolatrous country where you'll be so fed up with it, you'll never be idolatrous in that manner again." So as they're marching in the city and they're looking down on every single stone in the processional way, they're reading "to the glory of Marduk, to the glory of Marduk, to the glory of Marduk." Okay. If you actually looked at and examined the bricks that were, say, used to build Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the walls of his palace were like 135 feet thick. 135 feet thick. On every brick that made up his house was his name, Nebuchadrezzar. So in other words, most of your modern translations are going to say this. Some of your translations, if you have a King James or say an early translation of the Bible, sometimes it'll say this and sometimes it's going to say this. Okay. That's why I kind of broke it down. Like for instance, in Ezekiel uses Nebuchadrezzar. Okay. So anyway, oh, by the way, I'm going to, like the Hebrew kings and the prophets and stuff, I'm going to show you the correct way to pronounce this, because it is not pronounced Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to actually, you will learn the correct way to pronounce it, so that when you go in front of your classes and you give them the king, this guy's name, you're going to just come out and say the name, and people are going to say, "Who's that?" Okay, and you will be able to wow them with your intellectual knowledge and everything of your knowledge of Hebrew and Aramaic, and your students will be so impressed with your knowledge that they will not dare question you on anything. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned in 9 books of the Bible. 2 Kings, 6 times, all in chapter 24. First Chronicles once in chapter 6, verse 15. First Chronicles. And Second Chronicles 4 times, all in chapter 36. In the book of Ezra, 5 times. The book of Nehemiah, once in chapter 7, verse 6. Esther, once in chapter 2, verse 6. Jeremiah, 37 times. As Nebuchadnezzar, 10 times. And Nebuchadrezzar, 27 times. Ezekiel, 4 times as Nebuchadrezzar. And in the book of Daniel, 32 times as Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? So let's take a look at the meaning and pronunciation of the name from Jones's Dictionary of Old Testament Proper Names. Okay, so you don't want it in Hebrew, I'll just give it the English transliteration. Okay, you all remember what that means? I'm going to spell it phonetically in English, how you would actually say it in Hebrew. Okay? So you would say, I've got to make sure I get that right. Okay. I got it spelled phonetically better in my book, so let me hold up my page here so I don't get this wrong. Okay. It's more impressive if I write it in Hebrew. It's actually easier to write in Hebrew. Okay, so this one right here, Nebuchadnezzar, would be there's no Z's in his name. There's not a Z in Nebuchadnezzar. It's that word, it's the letter Tzadeh. So it's Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And here it would be almost the same thing, except instead of Netzar, it would be Retz. Nebuchadrezzar, okay? It'd be that would be the difference. So what is it when I put an E up there? What does that mean? It's a half vowel. It means like when you start to say ne, you don't say ne, you say ne. I mean, you get off it really quick. It's nevu. It's nevu, not nevu, but nevu. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. Everybody say that. Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay, you got it? Just like our Greek class, right? Nebuchadnezzar. That is the proper way to say Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you want to be an irritant in somebody else's class and they're teaching on Esther or Kings or whatever, and somebody says Nebuchadnezzar, you could say, I'm sorry, but that's Nebuchadnezzar, not Nebuchadnezzar. You pronounced that wrong, okay? They will quickly throw you out of the class, right? Okay. Oh. I was looking for the page. I said, what happened to page 8? Here it was. Okay. Nobody's interested in seeing it in Hebrew, right? The English is good enough. I really tried to drum up an interest in, like, say, take a beginning Hebrew where you'd learn the alphabet and how to actually read Hebrew, because, like, then when you study and you look at a good, like, say you read Highland Dalich's commentary on the Old Testament, they got the Hebrew words in there, or you look at a really good English commentary, they put the Greek or the Hebrew words in there in the original language, and you can actually read them. Or you look in a concordance and you can actually read the names yourself. It helps you. I think it just gives you confidence when you're using those sources and stuff. So anyway, Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar means Nebo is the god of fire. Nebo is really pronounced Nevo with a V. Nevo means Mercury or interpreter or foreteller. Nevu was the god of wisdom and writing. Okay. In other words, all of these famous persons were named after one of their gods.
How do you spell Nivu?
What?
Nivu?
You would actually spell it. How do I? Let me see how I got it here. Okay. Nebo, or is actually pronounced and spelled. Would you pronounce that Nevo? Nevo. How about if I did Nevo? Now it rhymes with my name. Okay. Remember, it's Nevu Kadnetzar. So Nevu. Okay. I could have written 00 too. When you see 00, do you think ooh? Okay. But when you just go Nevo, then when it's just by itself, and now it's like the long O sound and not the oo sound. Okay. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar is famous as a military leader, the founder of a vast empire, and for civil works of stupendous character. And he is no less remarkable for his dreams, according to Jones's Dictionary of Old Testament Proper Names. Okay. So let's take a look at Nebuchadnezzar's family. Nebuchadnezzar was the eldest son, of Nabopolassar, founder of the Chaldean or Neo-Babylon dynasty of Babylon. Oftentimes when you look up, if you look at the history of Babylon, there's Old Babylon. Who is the founder of Old Babylon?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Old Babylon.
Old Babylon. Wait. I know this. Is it?
Yeah. Got it. You're getting it.
Tower, right?
It's what? Everybody looks stumped.
Yeah, I know it.
Who is the founder of Old Babylon?
Nimrod.
Nimrod. Go back to Genesis. Great. Old Babylon, remember, it's literally the first city ever built. Okay. He is founder of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty of Babylon. What does the word Neo mean? What? New Babylon. So you've all heard of the city of York in England. The new city of York is New York. Same thing, right? Frankfurt in Germany is, capital of Kentucky is New Frankfurt? No, it's just Frankfurt.
Yeah.
Okay, they didn't put the word new. Okay.
They just copied it.
Yeah, you didn't know that?
That's about New Orleans.
Huh? What's that?
That's about New Orleans.
Same thing. There's an Orleans in France, New Orleans and New Mexico versus, where's Old Mexico? South of the border, right? South of our border. Yeah, right below Texas. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar had at least 2 wives. Nitocris, who gave birth to a daughter, and Amytis, also known as Amuhia, daughter of Astyages, king of the Medes. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar had at least 3 sons. Emil Marduk, called Evil Merodach in the scripture, which, by the way, was Nebuchadnezzar's successor. His second son was Marduk Sun Usar. His third son was Marduk Sun Lisur. By the way, was Marduk an important deity in Nebuchadnezzar's life? Must be, because he named 3 of his sons have Marduk in the name. Nebuchadnezzar had at least 1 brother, Nebu Suma Lisur. That's going to be a test question. Everybody must know, who was Nebuchadnezzar's brother?
Who?
Yeah. Nebu Suma Lisur. I'm just seeing if you guys are really paying attention. Abu, not Abu, but Nabu. Nabu Suma Lisur. Okay. You don't need to write it out. It'll be in the handout. Okay. By the way, which you're getting fairly shortly. You'll get the handout. So let's take a look at the history of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 6 September 605 BC to August or September 562 BC. So he could have almost died on his birthday. In 609 to 606 BC, Nabopolassar, now he's an aged old man, entrusted the Babylonian army to his crown prince, his eldest son, Nebuchadnezzar, okay? In May or June of 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar made a surprise attack on Carchemish, sacked the city, and annihilated the Egyptian army. I mean, if you actually read the Babylonian archives, they said they destroyed the Egyptian army to the last man. In other words, it was a complete and total defeat. At this time, he conquered Syria and Palestine. In other words, right after Carchemish, he came down, he conquered Syria and Palestine, which in the Babylonian tongue is called Hatti. Okay, so in other words, the Babylonian name for Syria and, by the way, I say Palestine, in other words, Israel and Judah. Okay, in Babylonian, it's Hatti. Okay. That's what they called it, okay? But that's English, by the way. That's what they called it. In other words, Israel at that time was, and Judah was the province of Hatti in Babylonia. Okay, and I got that, by the way, I got that information out of Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 10, verse 86. Anyway, it'd be nice to know, like if you ever learn Aramaic, that Hatti is the proper name for Judah or Israel. Daniel was among hostages taken from Judah, Daniel 1:1, where Jehoiakim was in his 4th regnal year, Jeremiah 36:1. By the way, what happens to Jehoiakim? First of all, you're going to hear that Nebuchadnezzar planned to take him to Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar has a change of mind. He says, nah, I'm going to kill him. And why does he want to do that? Because Jehoiakim was king. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and Jehoiakim swears that he will be loyal to Nebuchadnezzar. Well, shortly after that, Nebuchadnezzar is going to be defeated by the Egyptian army. Okay, this is what you don't really see in the scripture. Historically, the Babylonian army is defeated by the Egyptian army, and it's a pretty sound defeat. In fact, so sound and so successful defeat that Nebuchadnezzar had to go back to Babylon and build a new army. Well, Jehoiakim says, Egypt is the new power now. We don't have to worry about Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, so he switches sides. Well, a year later, Nebuchadnezzar comes back with his new army, and on the way down to defeat the Egyptians, he says, you traitor, you. What do you do with traitors? You kill them. That's why in Jeremiah it says he's going to die a donkey's death and have a donkey's burial. But he was treated like a criminal, just like Zedekiah was. But that's the kind of like the background. Why did Jehoiakim change sides? Why all of a sudden did he side with Egypt? Because it looked like Egypt was the winning side, and so he changed sides. Seemed like the prudent thing to do. Even though Jeremiah warned him, don't do it, you'll regret it. But they didn't listen to what Jeremiah said. Okay, so anyway, kind of repeat. While in the field, the field of battle, Nebuchadnezzar heard of his father's death and rode across the desert to claim the Babylonian throne. But he was actually, in the siege of Jerusalem, he actually heard of his father's death. So he literally rides across the desert and he secures the throne in Babylon. Remember, he's the crown prince. But if he would have stayed away too long, somebody else might have usurped the throne. So he heads back very quickly to claim his father's throne. In 601 BC, Egypt defeats Babylon. So again, at that time, that's when Jehoiakim, who gave his faithful promise in 605 BC, yes, Nebuchadnezzar, I will be totally loyal to you. And then when the Chaldeans, the Babylonian army, is defeated by the Egyptians, he switches sides. Does Nebuchadnezzar have a long memory? Yes, okay. So Jehoiakim transferred his loyalty to Egypt, and you read about that in Jeremiah 27. Nebuchadnezzar re-equipped the Babylonian army in preparations for subsequent reprisals on Jehoiakim and Judah, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. In other words, part of the reason for re-equipping his army was to get even with Judah. He says, you're not going to kick me while I'm down. In other words, not only was he going to go back and conquer Egypt, but he was going to, along the way, he was going to destroy Judah also. And remember in the prophecies in Jeremiah, remember Nebuchadnezzar has already destroyed Jerusalem, and then the people that are left say, what should we do? We want to go to Egypt. Should we go to Egypt? And remember Jeremiah said, no, do not go to Egypt, because if you do, you will die by the plague, by the sword, and by pestilence. And they said, we don't believe you, we're going anyway. And as a matter of fact, we're taking you with us. And so what happened? After Babylon had destroyed Judah, the Jews run on ahead to Egypt, and lo and behold, here comes the Babylonian army, and then they finish off the people that they didn't kill off in Judah. Oh, you guys again, you didn't learn your lesson, well, we'll just finish you off right here. And that's exactly what happened to them. Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem on March 16th, 597 BC. Jehoiakim was killed, and Jehoiakim, remember that was Jeconiah or Coniah, he was taken captive to Babylon. Remember Jehoiakim, he only ruled for 3 months and 10 days before, and then he was taken to Babylon. That's after his father was killed outside the walls of Jerusalem, and then basically had a donkey's burial, according to what Jeremiah said. In other words, he didn't get a king's burial. His burial was not for royalty. It was just, he killed him like an animal and buried him like an animal. So Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah on the throne of Judah, 2 Kings 24, 2 Chronicles 36. Then we have the second deportation, 16 March 597 BC. Jehoiakim and Ezekiel were taken captive to Babylon at this time, along with 10,000 skilled laborers. Now, I've given you time to think about these skilled laborers. Who were they? I mean, why is it important to bring over skilled laborers?
To build Babylon.
Does everybody hear that? What is Nebuchadnezzar doing at home? He's on a massive building spree. He's rebuilding the city of Babylon, and he's making it great. He's making it one of the, he's building some of the 7 wonders of the ancient world at that time. He needs skilled labor. So he just basically goes to all the different trade houses and stuff like that, and he doesn't kill those guys. He takes them to Babylon, says, we need your labor. You have been hired for government work. Like the guys that build the pyramids, all civil servants, right? 20 years building the pyramids. Okay. So anyway, here's a quote out of the Zondervan Encyclopedia of the Bible, Volume 1, page 446. Okay. Quote, skilled craftsmen from Judah were deported to assist in the immense building program then current in Babylon, unquote. Then we come to the third deportation. By the way, in the second deportation, they were not slaves. They were given homes and houses and stuff like that. Matter of fact, God even said, hey, don't think you're coming back soon. Make yourself at home, because you're going to be here for a few generations. So don't even think about going back home. So in the third deportation, Nebuchadnezzar, in the 17th and his 19th years, he was headquartered in Riblah, which is in modern-day Syria. Who's in modern-day Syria now? What famous terrorist group is, I mean, they're all have offices there, but what's the most recent famous terrorist group in Syria at this moment? ISIS, okay, yeah. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar is in Syria, in the city of Riblah, where he orchestrated the capture and destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. So his headquarters is 200 miles from the battle. And the capture of the rebellious king Zedekiah, because remember Zedekiah also rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. In 582 BC, or about this time, the 13-year siege of Tyre was undertaken. So like Ezekiel chapters 29, when it talks about the city, about the destruction of the city of Tyre, remember Nebuchadnezzar sieged the city of Tyre for 13 years. And then when he finally broke down the walls, remember, he was really pissed off because the city was empty. It was deserted. And after he breaks down the wall, he says, they're on a new city, because while he was trying to break down the walls of the old city, the Tyrians built a new city on an island a half a mile off the coast, taking all the gold and silver and all their valuables with them. So the army labored for 13 years and was not paid for their work. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar owed 13 years of back wages to his army. Where do you suppose he's going to pick up those back wages? Judah, and specifically Egypt. God literally says, I will pay you, Nebuchadnezzar, I will pay you and your army in Egypt when you plunder them. In other words, the wealth of Egypt was so great at that time, and literally all that wealth was carried off to Babylon. Because remember, Egypt was being judged at that time too. So anyway, let's talk about Nebuchadnezzar the builder, the master builder, okay? First of all, little is known of the last 30 years of his reign, okay? So a quote here out of the Illustrated Bible Dictionary. It says, quote, with the aid of his wife Amethyst, he undertook the rebuilding and embellishment of his capital, Babylon. Some of his architectural works were classed among the 7 wonders of the world, okay, unquote. So tradition also ascribes to him the Hanging Gardens. Have all you heard the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? The plain of Dura, where the city of Babylon sits, is flat. It's like living in Florida. I swear, if you're on the Atlantic and if you crawl up in a 2-story building, you can look all the way across the state and see the Gulf of Mexico 200 miles away. That's a joke, but I mean, literally, I mean, it's that flat. You know, it's barely above sea level. Okay. How do I know? I lived there. Okay, I lived in the mountains of Florida, in the city of Middleburg, the 2nd oldest city in the United States. But I bet none of you even knew that. St. Augustine. In the continental United States, St. Augustine is the oldest city in the continental United States. And Middleburg is the 2nd oldest. Ponce de Leon, after St. Augustine was established, they're searching for gold, and they're looking for routes to the Pacific, so they get in the St. John's River. He sails up the St. John's River, which at that point is like several miles wide, so it's like the Mississippi. And they turn up Black Creek. And when they get to the end of Black Creek, their ships won't go any farther, and where they land, they build a settlement, and that's the settlement of Middleburg. I lived in Middleburg for like 5 years. 2nd oldest city in the continental United States.
What Jamestown?
Jamestown was built 9 years. It was 9 years before Plymouth. You know, Jamestown was like 1611. Sorry, 1611, 1609, something like that. 1620, you know, for Plymouth Rock. St. Augustine, 1542. Okay. In other words, the Spanish were there a long time before the English were. Anyway, in Middleburg, this is really important. You will recognize Middleburg. Have you ever seen The Creature from the Black Lagoon? Movie made in the 50s. Black Creek was made famous with that movie because that's where the movie was filmed. Black Creek. Okay.
Where is St. Augustine?
Huh? St. Augustine's on the southern coast of Florida. It's south of Jacksonville, about 60 miles. Okay, but before you get to Daytona Beach. If you go to St. Augustine, they don't speak Spanish, they speak New Jersey. Because basically the town has been resettled by people that live in New Jersey. It's where all their summer homes are. How do I know? Because I was there. Okay. Okay. So I lived in Middleburg for 5 years. There was no other way that you would know that Middleburg is the second oldest city in America if you didn't actually live there. Okay. So anyway, we look at Nebuchadnezzar the builder. He was responsible for the building of Babylon's double walls, the processional way, and numerous temples dedicated to Babylonian deities. He also had built many canals for a continuous water supply. Nebuchadnezzar built a 90-foot golden image of himself to be worshipped, Daniel chapter 3. That's just one of those little hints, you remember, that he was a great builder. Well, it's not that he did it himself, but he'd just say, make it so, like Jean-Luc Picard, the new Star Trek. Old for you guys, but make it so, number one. Okay. So anyway, let's talk about Nebuchadnezzar being out of his mind. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar's successful building projects gave him tremendous pride. So remember in Daniel chapter 4, Daniel records Nebuchadnezzar as saying, Daniel says Nebuchadnezzar saying, quote, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by the mighty power and by the honor of my majesty?" What happens to Nebuchadnezzar? Here's a voice from heaven, and he finds out very quickly who is really in charge. And remember, he becomes like a beast. Remember, it says he grows his nails long like eagle's claws, and he grows his hair long, and he eats the grass like the beasts of the field. And whether it's say for 7 months or 7 years, I believe 7 years, seven seasons, he's literally insane for 7 years, believing himself to be an animal. God preserves his throne because remember the dream that he has, because remember God warned him. Nebuchadnezzar says, I dreamed of this tree, and it was cut down. There was brass bonds put around it, and so it's like he's saying to Daniel, what does this mean? And then Daniel says, oh God, Nebuchadnezzar, if only this was for your enemies instead of for you. The tree is referring to you. And then Daniel, he tells him what the dream means. It says, the kingdom is going to be taken away from you so that you will learn that kingdoms are given to people by God himself. And so Daniel gives him biblical counsel and says, if you humble yourself and if you attribute all your works to God, this won't happen. But what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He's a year later, he's up in the tower looking, wow, look at this city. It could not have been built without me. I am a mighty monarch. And that's literally when God speaks to him, and he literally loses his mind. Okay? Daniel chapter 4. By the way, and when he finally comes back to his senses, remember when he comes back to his senses, he literally comes back and he's praising the God of heaven, who is the sovereign of the universe, and he recognizes the fact that all authority comes from God, which is Daniel chapter 4. So anyway, let's take a look at the biblical importance of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Historical importance. Number one, Nebuchadnezzar was the king who brought the Davidic dynasty to an end. He carried its last legitimate king, Jehoiakim, captive to Babylon. So he's famous, number one, for he ended the Davidic dynasty at that time. God promised a dynasty forever. The next king, Judean king, who's going to sit on the throne is going to be Christ himself, and that hasn't happened yet, has it? It's going to happen in the kingdom sometime in the future. Number two, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, was God's servant. The Lord says, quote, my servant, unquote, to come against the land of Judah and its inhabitants for sins committed against God. In other words, God says, I personally raised up Nebuchadnezzar for the destruction of my people and their deportation for disobeying me. So God calls Nebuchadnezzar his servant. And then number 3, the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar is so important, it is recorded in Scripture 4 times. 2 Kings 25, 2 Chronicles 36, Jeremiah 39 verses 1 through 12, and Jeremiah chapter 52 verses 1 through 30. It is, in other words, the destruction of Jerusalem. It's also called the Day of the Lord. In a few locations, an ancient event is classified as the Day of the Lord, and the destruction of Jerusalem is one of those times. So the fact that it's mentioned in the Bible makes it important, but when God describes it in 4 different places, it must be important. And there's several books where God prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem. So that event is, biblically, is incredibly important. So you have to not look at it as just ancient history. It literally, it should affect the way that you think biblically too. And then second, we have the apocalyptic importance of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was given a dream by God that laid out in Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 45, the course of human history until the establishment of the millennial kingdom. So again, this is why this time is important. Anytime God was going to start something new, remember, for ever since the days of Moses, well, first God has Abraham in the land, but when God establishes the nation of Israel, they are supposed to be a light and a beacon to the Gentiles. Were they? Not very much were they, except for Jonah, the reluctant prophet, by the way. Remember, when God gave him a commission to go to Nineveh, remember Jonah said, I am going to Tarshish. I'm going to southern Spain on vacation. So God says, go 800 miles east. Jonah is headed 3,000 miles west. He's getting as far away as he possibly can from the city of Nineveh. We'll talk about that and what actually swallowed Jonah when we actually get to Jonah. You'll be surprised, because it's not going to be a fish and it's not going to be a whale. Not if you go by the original languages. Okay, so we look at the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. We look at what Nebuchadnezzar did. He terminates the Davidic dynasty. At that time begins the times of the Gentiles. Does everybody know what a Gentile is, by the way? Who here is a Gentile? Unless you have some Jewish blood in you that you don't know about. If you're not Jewish, you're a Gentile, okay? So the times of the Gentiles begin with the destruction of Jerusalem. From that time on until the establishment of the kingdom, we are in the times of the Gentiles. And at the beginning of that was with Nebuchadnezzar. So every time there's a major turning point in history, you'll usually see like miracles and stuff like that will accompany it, and God talks about it a whole lot. That's why it's just mentioned so many times. But that is the times of the Gentiles at their beginning. So the apocalyptic importance or the prophetic importance for Nebuchadnezzar is tremendous in the Bible. God revealed to Nebuchadnezzar what was to take place in the latter days. Quoting Daniel, quote, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. Remember, that's when he has the dream about the statue with finally going down to the feet made of iron and partly of iron, partly of clay, and then this giant rock coming out from space smashes the... Can you imagine? Who here would want to have a big rock dropped on your foot? It really hurts, doesn't it? Anyway, that's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. And that's, of course, the rock, the stone of stumbling, which brings in the millennial kingdom. Okay, I can finish, and I can get everything passed out. Can you all last like 15 more minutes?
Yeah.
I'm looking at all of your eyes.
Do you mind if I use the restroom?
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break. 5 minutes, take a quick one, okay? The biblical importance of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, now we're going to look at the commentary. Remember, historical importance, and then there was the apocalyptic or the prophetic importance. So as we look at the commentary on Daniel, we'll look at the outline first. First, we have the personal background of Daniel, chapter 1. The conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. By the Babylonian dating, it's the year 606, 605 BC. King Jehoiakim is killed. The Jews are taken to Babylon for training, and 4 persons are named. Daniel is renamed Belteshazzar. Hananiah is renamed Shadrach. By the way, Hananiah is not Hananiah, it's Hananiah. Okay, like the word Hannah is not Hannah, it's Hannah. You have to like clear your throat and spit. Okay. Mishael is renamed Meshach, and Azariah is renamed Abednego. In other words, they're all given Babylonian names. Again, in chapter 1, no compromise. Remember, they're not going to compromise their godly principles. So the 4 men, Daniel, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, decide to obey God's laws. And they do that concerning diet. And God rewards them with superior wisdom. After 3 years of intense training, they are at the top of their class. Now remember, they start their training. What happened just prior to their training? What happened?
Too, they're going to school and everything.
What happened right before they went, before they were enrolled? What was part of the requirements for being enrolled in school? Castration. I bet you, if that was one of the requirements for this Bible college, I bet there wouldn't be a single guy here. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was a pretty intense, right? In other words, they wanted to be sure that these young men gave 100% of their attention to the studies that they had. So after 3 years of intense training, they are at the top of their class. And the 4 Jews are awarded royal positions. Roman numeral number 2, the prophetic course of the Gentile nations, that's all the way from chapter 2 all the way through chapter 7. And we start off with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel's recounting of it and its interpretation. That's chapter 2. Remember, the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the chest and arms of silver, Medo-Persia, belly and thighs of bronze, that's Greece, legs of iron, Rome, and the feet partly of iron, partly of clay, that's revived Rome. Nebuchadnezzar's, again, then he constructs a golden image. He took the head of gold and he said, hey, maybe I can change the course of history if I just make the whole image out of gold. That was his thinking, okay? And at that point in Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saved from the fiery furnace, okay? Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the chopped down tree is sickness, and his testimony is chapter 4. Belshazzar's feast and the handwriting on the wall, chapter 5. The fall of Babylon is predicted in that chapter. Daniel in the lion's den, chapter 6. This occurs, of course, during the Medo-Persian era. And then Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts, the Ancient of Days, and its interpretation, that's chapter 7. Remember, there was the lion with eagle's wings, that was Babylon. The bear, Medo-Persia. Remember the bear? He walked funny because 2 legs on one side are higher than the 2 legs on the other. So the bear kind of walked with a double limp, sort of. A leopard with 4 wings represents Greece. And a tanned-horned beast and 1 little horn represents the 2 stages of the Roman Empire. Then, of course, the Ancient of Days being identified as God the Father. How do we know? Because one like a son of man appears before the Ancient of Days. One like the Son of Man, of course, is the title that Jesus Christ took for himself. Then we have the prophetic course of Israel's future, chapter 8, all the way through 12. And chapter 8, we have the ram and the male goat. The ram and the bear, of course, being counterpoints. Remember, the bear, the two legs, say, on the right side being longer than the two legs on the left side, corresponds with the ram with the two horns, the longer horn coming up last. The ram had two horns, but the longer horn grows after the shorter horn. And of course, they both refer to the Medo-Persian Empire. Then the male goat is Greece with a one big conspicuous horn between his eyes. The horn is broken off and four little horns show up in its place. The large horn is Alexander the Great. The four horns are the four Greek generals, Lysimachus, who became the ruler of Thrace and Asia Minor, Cassander, he took over Macedonia, Seleucus, he got Syria, and then Ptolemy, he got Egypt. And of course, chapter 11 focuses on Seleucus and Ptolemy, calling Seleucus of Syria the king of the north and Ptolemy the king of the south. Okay. Then we have the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. Antichrist and the 7-year tribulation being highlighted in chapters 9 verses 24 to 27. Israel's humiliation and restoration in chapter 10 all the way through chapter 12. And then chapter 10 is unique. We have a look at battles in the spiritual realm. It's very coterminous with Ezekiel chapters 8 through 10. Then we have the wars. By the way, Ezekiel and Daniel, they're getting these dreams about war in the spiritual realm at about the same time. So God is like handing these out at the same time. We have wars between the king of the north and the king of the south, which start with the original Seleucus and Ptolemy. And remember Seleucus, one of the other family names for Seleucus is Antiochus. So Antiochus IV being descended from General Seleucus. They finally become the king of the north and king of the south, extends all the way into the tribulation period at the end of Daniel chapter 11. Then chapter 12, we have the resurrection at the end of the age. Okay? And that's the book of Daniel. So we spent very little time on the commentary of Daniel. But I gave you a whole bunch of stuff about the book, and yet I did not, I repeat, I did not exegete a single verse in the book. Okay? That would be for like if you have a course on Daniel. This is to give you, oh, it's from heaven. Mind if I take this real quick? It's my wife. I dare not answer. Hello? Hi, sweetie. She hung up. I bet she remembered I'm in class. Okay. That's right. Okay. Let me go ahead and pass out your handouts now. Okay, this is for, this is the book of Daniel. Remember, everything in the handout you are responsible for on the test, even if I don't cover it. Okay. Okay. I'm going to pass it back? Okay. Hit them right between the eyes. Max? Oscar? Okay, here. Okay, sorry, oh, this one's deformed. Let me get you another one. Okay. Had a earmark. There you go. If you're interested in the Hebrew, written out in Hebrew, I stopped giving you the Hebrew writing. I didn't think you guys were interested. But if you're interested, I'll actually put it up there sometime. In my notes, it's written in Hebrew. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Next week, I'm gonna give you your assignment for your paper that's due. Okay. So there are no questions. Two. This is the Old Testament, and then there's another one, also brown. Oh, this one? 10 volumes. I just brought out the books that cover the prophets.
It's different from this one, right? From the brown one.
This one, If I had all 10 volumes here, it's equal to this one. Much more in depth. Again, this is the standard that I say go to any pastor's, senior pastor's office, you will see a copy of this commentary if they're fundamental and conservative. They will not be without this commentary. In fact, if you want to know what your pastors believe, go into their library and check the books that they got. And I guarantee you'll see this series.
Do you have one to recommend for just the book of Daniel?
Dr. John Walvoord has a really good one. But if you want one that's incredibly readable, I would recommend that you get the 5-volume set by Dr. J. Vernon McGee, Through the Bible. He goes into incredible depth. He was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary also, but he speaks in a very plain style, and you don't realize the depth of knowledge that you're getting, and he's actually funny when he's writing. I mean, like even in Revelation, he'll translate the Revelation. He'll put down the translation, King James, and says, here's my translation. He says, I'm not an expert at Greek. I've only had 8 years of Greek, but I'm not an expert. But he says, I know enough to translate. So he'll have his translation. You get incredible depth of knowledge, very good commentary. It's one you could just sit and read all the way through.
What's that one called?
Through the Bible,
With
J. Vernon McGee. Yeah. It's literally a transcript of his radio. It'd take 5 years to go through the Bible on the radio, and you can get it in 5 volumes now. It also comes in like paper pamphlets. But I would recommend his book just because the depth and readability. Okay, let's go ahead.